Welcome back. In this third module in the class on how to invoke the ideal self, the first discovery in intentional change theory, how to help somebody build their sense of hope through personal vision, I'd like to build on the earlier research we were talking about and just tell you about Kathy Buse's doctoral dissertation. Kathy was a former engineer for 25 years or so in industry, who was puzzled, as many people have been, by the fact that many women who start in engineering or sciences leave the field. So she looked at what are the things that predict women who decide to stay in engineering or science. So she sampled women in these fields, varying ages, and what she found was amazing. That the thing that predicts career commitment and therefore career stability, staying in the field, is career engagement. And the thing that predicts career engagement and commitment are predominantly three factors. First, it is the degree of the woman's hope about the field and her ability to contribute. Second, it is the degree of specificity in the ideal self, the personal vision that she has developed about her sense of hope and her sense of purpose. And the third is the relationship she has to her manager. In our shorthand, to what extent is it a resonant relationship? It is very likely that these are the same kinds of factors that affect many of us in our various roles or occupations. What I'd like to do is, before we talk about the action learning assignment from this class, is to go to one last aspect of our model of the ideal self that we talked about in the last module. One of those elements was the person's life and career stage or cycle. Now, one of the things that people have noted in terms of an observation or clinically for many years is that about every 7 years, plus or minus 2 in our lives, we go through a cycle of excitement to boredom. And that cycle seems to go on throughout our lives. In 1976, Dan Levinson wrote a book on the seasons of a man's life, and he is attributed with creating the expression midlife crisis. His contention at the time was that it's typical for a man, and later in a book published posthumously, co-authored with his wife, Judy Levinson, Seasons of a Woman's Life, that a man or a woman, somewhere around the age 30, will go through a period of transition that could last 2 to 5 years, and they will be restless with what's happening in their life or in their work. Then they try something, they get on a path, they do it for, again, 7 years or so, plus or minus 2, and then they enter around the age of 40-ish, 38 to 45, another period of questioning. Is this going right? Do I have to readjust it? Do I have to find a new path? Is this not the real me? And then they do it again around 50 and around 60 and around 70. So it feels like a perpetual rhythm. How do you know if you're starting or into a midlife crisis or a transition, if you want to think about it more positively? It's not that hard. You think about whether or not you're really excited with your life, or are you starting to feel bored, or you feel like the music of life isn't ringing in your ears. Sometimes we don't feel it as boredom, but we actually start to wonder, is there more in life? What else could I be doing? So sometimes you start to feel restless or even homesick, but you're in your home. It ends up being a vague uneasiness. Now, why does this matter? Well, if people don't stay aware of these things when they start, if they aren't emotionally intelligent and mindful about what's going on in their life, in their career, they might misdiagnose it. And very often people do. They start to feel this restlessness and they feel guilty about it if they're doing well and they're not doing well. They feel ashamed. They don't talk about it with other people around them, so they start to think that something's wrong with them, and they repress it. And what happens is when you repress these kinds of issues, they pop out. Psychologically, we say you act them out. Of course, there's the cliche of the 50-year-old man who goes out and buys a red sports car, or a woman in her late 30s or 40s who starts to wonder and feel restless about these things and then looks for alternative forms of excitement. And it has often been noted that an awful lot of people end up having affairs, or they end up taking up hobbies that are very dangerous, or starting something just because they don't feel excited. But in fact, if they spent more time reflecting on what was really happening, they might be able to have a more functional, a healthier, a better turn of events. Certainly, one of the early developmental theories about this was Sigmund Freud's, Carl Jung and others. Erik Erikson probably was the most masterful at creating a model that's called a life stage model, that at each point in life we have certain issues that face us, and either we resolve them and move up and ahead, or we don't and we're stuck. And that sometimes a crisis occurs and we backslide down these steps and we have to start going up them again. My observation is these life stage models always have one way is better, up is better than not, and the top ends up being the pinnacle. Unfortunately, I think the top, the ultimate stage in one's development, is very often more described by the values and culture of the scientist or author of these things than what happens. Other theories are called life cycle theories, like the Levinson's theories. They're really life sequence. They say we go through these things in a continuous way, in a sequence in our lives. Gail Sheehy, in her masterful book, The New Passages, in 1995, did a marvelous job of interviewing a lot of men and women in different walks of life throughout the United States, showing that this rhythm, this sequence through, happens to all of us. But as she pointed out, in modern days, in the 90s, and for women who right now have professions, not just women who are staying at home, that very often these categories, these cycles are accordioned. That having a child could move the accordion into the next stage faster. Having a death of a parent, or certainly the death of a spouse, could elongate your period in one of these. There is a third type of theory of these, which marks the transitions, that you have key transitions. And then David Kolb of Case Western Reserve University, myself in the early 90s, even developed another theory that said we go through cycles of periods of trying to wrestle with our own mastery. And then we get bored with that and we go into a cycle, 7 years plus or minus 2, of wrestling with novelty. What can we do that's different? And then we start to feel that's empty or hollow in some way. So then we go into what we call a cycle of a quest for meaning, wanting to contribute, be generative, and help. Whichever of these it is, I think it is very important that you stay tuned to where are you in these cycles. And by the way, as Ed Schein described in a magnificent book in the late 60s on career dynamics, that we go through these cycles with our work. We also go through them with our families and with our own bodies and our spiritual selves. So staying in tune with where you are in the cycles is a very important part of you being able to build your ideal self. So now let me come to the action learning assignment. The assignment for this week is for you to draft a personal vision. If you take the model of the ideal self that we talked about in the last module, I would like you to start to reflect on each one of these components. If you have the ability to access the workbook that I mentioned that Annie McKee and myself and Fran Johnson published in 2008 called Becoming a Resonant Leader, there are 19 of these exercises in Chapter 4 that will help you to invoke or elicit some of these different reflections. But if you don't have access to the book or you can't afford it, don't worry. We're going to show you on the assignment sheet on the website a number of questions that you could use to reflect on. Some of them are similar to what we talked about in an earlier module. If I won $50 million after tax in a lottery, how would my life or work change? What values are most important to me, or virtues? If I was acting with these values and virtues, would I feel proud of myself? Would I want my mother to be proud of me? What are the things I would love to do and live through before I die? And we're not just talking about a general statement like I'd like to travel. You really, to develop this personal vision, you should be specific. Travel where? For how long? What are the places you'd like to visit and explore versus what are the places you'd like to go back to? What are the places you might like to live for a while? And there are a number of these types of reflections. As you come to grips with what are the dreams and fantasies, your personal vision may not be that you will be able to reach all of them, but I can assure you, if you don't identify them, the likelihood that you'll reach them drops to 5 to 10%. It is amazing how much intentionality can change the path of our lives. I'd like you to write up your personal vision, and very often it's a paper that ends up being 2 to 4 pages long. It should capture what kind of relationships you would love to have in the future. And don't think about probabilities. You're not trying to predict. You're trying to say, if my life were absolutely great in 10 to 15 years, what would it be like? In terms of my key relationships, my family, a partner or spouse, in terms of my physical health, in terms of my spiritual health, in terms of my contributions to the community, and yes, in terms of my work, both the work I do for pay and the work I do in volunteer work or for various eleemosynary activities. Once you have and collect these reflections, I'd like you to put them into a personal vision essay. And then what I'd like you to do is to share that essay, your personal vision, with several people in your life who are important to you, with whom you have resonant relationships. And if you're older and feel that you really can't afford to think about 10 to 15 years in the future, then I would suggest you not worry about the number and just say, how would I love to be living my life? And still engage a personal vision. And we know that if you do this, you will increase the likelihood that you get closer and closer to that vision. So, I really hope you do the assignment and share it with others and have some great conversations about it. Thank you, and see you in the next module.